The agronomist was mid-sentence when he stopped, not because he forgot what he was saying, because he had just seen something that shouldn't exist. He drove the shovel into the ground, lifted a block of dark soil, heavy, damp, alive. He broke it apart in his hands and started counting. 1, 5, 10, 20. He stopped at 40. Not because there weren't more, because he didn't believe the number. "Who manages this field?" he asked, without looking up. "I do," the farmer said behind him. "What are you putting on it?" A pause. "Nothing." 15 years. I haven't put anything on this soil. No fertilizer, no herbicide, no pesticide, nothing. The agronomist looked back down at the soil in his hands. It crumbled easily, dark, soft, smelled like a forest after rain, alive. Not healthy soil, untouched soil. But that didn't make sense. This land sat in the middle of the Corn Belt, 300 acres, farmed continuously for nearly a century. This soil should have been tired, compacted, dependent. Not this. He finally asked, "When did you start?" 1996. One decision, one mistake, according to everyone at the time. 15 years earlier, on this exact same ground, another man stood here. Clean shirt, clean boots, company truck parked at the edge of the field. He opened a briefcase, pulled out numbers. "You need to increase yield. Your soil is nitrogen deficient. Weeds will take your profit if you don't control them. If you don't follow this program, you won't survive." His name was Mark Halverson, regional sales manager, one of the largest ag chemical companies in the Midwest. And at the time, he wasn't wrong. Caleb Turner, 32 years old, had just taken over the farm after his father died. 320 acres. For 2 years, he did everything right. Spray, fertilize, control, optimize. Total input cost, $42,000 a year. Everyone paid it. No one questioned it. Until one night, kitchen table, an old notebook, and his grandmother. "Did Grandpa ever spend this much?" She didn't answer right away. She just looked at the number, then said quietly, "Your grandfather never bought any of that." Caleb thought she was mistaken. She wasn't. His grandfather had farmed the same land for 40 years, without chemicals, without debt, without losing the farm. That night, Caleb went up to the attic, opened an old trunk. Inside was something nobody keeps anymore. Handwritten farm records. 50 years of them. Yields, costs, profit, every season, every acre. He spent 3 nights going through it, running the numbers, checking everything. What he found kept him awake. His father produced more, but barely kept more, while spending 10 times as much and taking all the risk. 3 days later, Mark Halverson came back. Same visit, same briefcase, same assumption. Caleb looked at him and said 4 words, "I'm done spraying." Mark didn't understand at first. Then he did. Only laugh. The kind that says, "This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard." "You'll destroy this soil." 3 seasons, maybe less. "Weeds will take everything." "Your yields will collapse, and you'll come back." Caleb didn't argue. He just said, "This land worked before that system existed. It can work again." Mark stood up, closed his briefcase, and said one last thing before leaving. "You're killing the thing that feeds you." 15 years later, the agronomist stood in that same field, holding the most alive soil he had ever seen, and he had no way to explain it. What Caleb did in the spring of 1996 looked like failure from the road. No fertilizer, no herbicide, no pesticide. Instead, He planted rye after soybeans and clover after corn. Let it grow all winter into early spring. Then he flattened it, not with chemicals, with a roller he built himself, steel drum, welded ribs, pulled behind an old tractor. The cover crop fell and stayed there, a thick mat across the entire field. Then Caleb planted directly into it. No tilling, no bare soil, just seed into life. The first year was rough. Corn dropped to 95 bushels, soybeans to 32. From the road, it looked bad. Uneven stands, weeds breaking through in patches. Nothing like the clean, perfect rows next door. At the co-op, people noticed. Turner's losing it. He'll be back next year. That ground won't survive 2 seasons. Caleb heard all of it, didn't respond, just kept going. Year 2 was worse. Corn fell again, 88 bushels. The soil wasn't dead, it was adjusting. Years of chemicals had suppressed everything beneath the surface. Now it had to rebuild, slowly. His neighbor to the west, Dan Holbrook, stopped him one afternoon. "Caleb, I've watched this farm for 20 years. Your father ran it right. What you're doing, this isn't farming." Caleb didn't answer right away. Dan kept going. "You've got weeds blowing into my ground. Your yields are down 30%. You're dragging this whole township down with you." Caleb finally looked at him. "How much did you spend last year?" Dan didn't answer. 45,000? Silence. "I spent less than 5. Dan shook his head. "That doesn't matter if you're not producing." Caleb said quietly, "It matters if I'm keeping more." Dan walked away, told everyone at the diner Caleb Turner had lost his mind. But Caleb wasn't watching the road, he was watching the soil. He started digging, every week, same spot, same depth. First year, almost nothing. Second year, more life, worms, fungi. By year 3, the shovel went in easier. Water didn't sit on top anymore. It soaked in, stayed. That's when Caleb noticed something else. His costs hadn't changed, still under 5,000, while everyone else was going the other direction. Fertilizer prices went up. Herbicide programs got heavier, more chemicals, more passes, more cost. By year 5, something shifted. Corn came back, 105. Soybeans, 40. Still below average, but not by much. And his soil was no longer the same soil. The cover crops were doing more than feeding the ground. They were controlling weeds. Not perfectly, but enough. Every season, pressure dropped. Not because he sprayed, because the system balanced itself. Dan stopped complaining around year 6, not because he agreed, because he had bigger problems. Water hemp, resistant. The chemicals didn't work like they used to. He had to spray more, spend more, fight harder for worse results. Caleb didn't have that problem. His weeds didn't evolve because nothing was selecting them. Everything got suppressed equally. By year 8, the gap closed. Corn hit 135. Soybeans matched the county. But the real difference wasn't yield, it was cost. Caleb was still under 5,000. The county average was pushing 50. For the first time, Caleb Turner wasn't just surviving. He was ahead. and nobody at the co-op was laughing anymore. By the time year 10 came around, most farmers in the county had stopped talking about Caleb. Not because they agreed with him, because they didn't understand him. From the road, his fields didn't look impressive. They didn't have that perfect uniform green. They didn't look like a brochure. But if you stepped into them, everything felt different. The ground was softer, not loose, not fluffy, alive. Water didn't pool after rain. It disappeared into the soil, stayed there. And when it didn't rain, that's when the difference showed. The summer of 2007 started dry, then it stayed dry. June passed with almost no rain. July came, hotter. By mid-July, corn across the county started to curl. Leaves rolled tight by noon. Fields turned from green to gray, then brown. Farmers started walking their fields earlier each morning, not to check growth, to measure damage. By August, it wasn't a bad year anymore. It was a crisis. County average yield projections dropped fast, 150 to 120, then under 100. And the worst part wasn't the heat, it was the soil. Most fields couldn't hold water anymore. Years of tillage, years of chemicals had left the ground tight. Rain, when it came, ran off, didn't soak in. Roots hit hardpan at 8 inches, stopped. The plants had nowhere to go, no water to reach. Dan Holbrook's farm was one of them. By late July, his corn was already failing, leaves firing early, ears not filling. He stood at the edge of his field one afternoon, watching it happen. Then he looked across the fence and saw something that didn't make sense. Caleb's field was still green. Not perfect, not uniform, but alive. Dan got in his truck, drove down the road, stopped at the edge of Caleb's field, sat there, engine running, didn't get out, just watched. Because everything he believed about farming said this shouldn't be possible. By August, the difference was undeniable. County average yield dropped to 94 bushels. Dan's fields barely made 70. After costs, he lost money, real money. He took out a loan that winter, not to grow, to survive. Caleb Turner harvested 131 bushels. Not record-breaking, but steady, and his costs hadn't changed. Under $5,000. No emergency, no loan, no panic, just a harvest. The drought that broke everyone else barely touched him, and the reason was under his feet. Over 14 years, his soil had changed. Organic matter more than doubled. That meant something most farmers never calculated: water. Every 1% increase in organic matter held tens of thousands of extra gallons per acre. Caleb's soil held water like a sponge. Everyone else's fields rejected it. His roots went deeper, 20, 30 inches. No hardpan, no barrier. And above the soil, the cover crop residue stayed, shading the ground, keeping it cool, reducing evaporation. Everything worked together, not because Caleb added more, because he stopped interfering. Dan drove past that field again in September. This time, he pulled over, turned off the engine, sat there in silence. 10 minutes, maybe more. Then he drove home, didn't say a word to anyone, because for the first time, he wasn't angry. He was thinking. And across the county, other farmers were starting to notice too. Not the yields, the pattern. The only fields that held were the ones that looked different, the ones nobody had taken seriously. And for the first time, people started asking a question they should have asked years earlier. What if the system was the problem? The first person who came to ask for help wasn't a stranger. It was Dan Holbrook. He didn't come during planting, didn't come during harvest. He came in late October, after the numbers were done, after the losses were real. Caleb was in his shop, working on the planter. Dan pulled in, sat in his truck for a full minute before getting out. That alone told Caleb everything. Dan Holbrook didn't hesitate, didn't ask for advice, didn't admit uncertainty until now. Show me what you're doing. No pride, no argument, just that. Caleb wiped his hands, looked at him for a second, then nodded. Come on. They walked into the field, the same ground Dan had stared at all summer, but this time he stepped onto it and felt it. The soil didn't crack under his boots, didn't crumble dry. It held. Caleb took a shovel, drove it into the ground, easy, turned it over, broke it apart. Look. Dan crouched. Earthworms everywhere. Not one or two, dozens. Dan reached down, picked up a handful, didn't say anything, because he knew what it meant. Healthy soil, living soil, something his own fields didn't have anymore. What did you put on this? Nothing. Dan let out a breath. Nothing. For how long? 15 years. Dan shook his head, not in disagreement, in realization, because 15 years earlier he'd made the opposite decision. Spray more, add more, push harder, and every year the costs went up. Every year the soil got worse, until the drought came and exposed everything. That winter, Dan made a choice, quietly, no announcement, no explanation. He planted his first cover crop. Not all his acres, just 40. The worst 40. The ground that had failed him the hardest. The ground he had nothing left to lose on. Other farmers watched, same way they had watched Caleb, with skepticism, with distance, waiting for it to fail, because if it worked, it meant something uncomfortable. It meant they'd been wrong. Year one, Dan's test field looked messy, just like Caleb's had. Lower yield, uneven growth, weeds in places. The coffee shop noticed. Holbrook's trying that no spray nonsense now. Give him 2 years. He'll be back. Dan didn't argue. He just kept going. Year two, the soil started to change. Not dramatically, but enough. Water didn't sit as long after rain. The ground didn't bake as hard in July. He noticed it, even if no one else did. Year three, the yield stabilized. Still not perfect, but no longer collapsing. And the costs dropped way down. That's when other farmers started paying attention, not to the field, to the math, because nothing gets attention faster than someone making more money. By 2010, 4 farmers in the county had started transitioning. By 2015, more than a dozen. Not full conversions, not overnight, but pieces. A field here, a test plot there, enough to see, enough to learn. And the pattern repeated. First, it looked worse. Then, it held steady. Then, it improved. Not just yields, the soil, the costs, the stress. The county didn't change overnight. Most didn't switch. Many never would. Because change like that doesn't spread fast. It spreads quietly, field by field, farmer by farmer, decision by decision. And at the center of it was still Caleb. Not speaking, not teaching, just farming, the same way every year, because the proof was already in the ground, and for those willing to look, it had been there all along. Let me tell you how this ends. Not with a breakthrough, not with a miracle, but with time. 20 years after Caleb Foster said 4 words at a kitchen table, "I'm done spraying," an agronomist stood in his field, holding a shovel full of soil, and forgot what he was about to say, because what he was looking at didn't make sense. Not in the system he had studied, not in the system he had been teaching. He broke the soil apart, counted earthworms, lost count, 40 in one spade. He'd tested soil across the county for over 2 decades. He had never seen anything like it. Who manages this ground? I do. What are you putting on it? Nothing. How long? 15 years. The agronomist looked back down at the soil, and for the first time, he didn't have an answer. Because everything he knew said this shouldn't exist. Soil without inputs was supposed to decline. Yields without chemicals were supposed to collapse. Fields without spraying were supposed to fail. But this field was the healthiest ground in the county, and it had been built by doing less. Caleb didn't celebrate, didn't publish anything, didn't go on stage. He just kept farming the same way, because for him, this was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about surviving. And then something else happened. His son came back, not because the farm was struggling, but because it wasn't, because it made sense, because it worked. They farmed together. Same land, same system. Now across more acres. No chemicals, no debt pressure, no dependency on input prices, just soil that kept getting better. By the time people started calling it regenerative, Caleb had already been doing it for 20 years, before it had a name, before it was a movement, when it was just a risk, a lonely one. Some of his neighbors never changed. Some tried and quit. Some waited too long. Because change like this doesn't come from information. It comes from pressure, from drought, from loss, from numbers that stop working. And when that pressure comes, people remember. They remember the field that stayed green. They remember the farmer who didn't follow the system. They remember what worked. Caleb's grandfather was never on a podcast, never quoted in a journal. He just wrote in a ledger. Simple numbers, simple notes. Feed the soil feeds you. Caleb followed that, and the soil remembered. So here's the part most people miss. This story isn't about chemicals, it's about dependence. When you build a system that only works as long as everything else does, and what happens when you build one that works anyway. The salesman said the soil would die. The soil came back to life. The county said the yields would collapse. The profits stayed. The system said it wouldn't work, but the ground didn't listen. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered.